with a view of the bookshop in general, and we're going to pan. Of course, since you're all here, you can actually see it. You don't. Yeah. Nowadays, everybody looks through their cell phones to see whatever's happening, but here you're live and can see it here live. You probably get my voice on this now, right?
Yes,
oh,
yes.
Okay.
You edited it out, though.
We're live. That's right. We're live. Yeah.
You say that now.
So, it'll probably come back on at some point.
Okay. So I'd like to say hello to everybody, and not only would I like to say hello to everybody, I will say hello, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Otto Penzler, and this is my bookshop. We've celebrated more than 42 years in business, which is pretty miraculous in this environment. Oh, hi, Wendy. Sorry. And tonight we're going to talk about, this is the first event in this bookshop that has ever been held for one of my books. So I'm kind of excited about this. So we're going to talk about a book, not only that I edited, but that I published, kind of published. The publisher, I have 4 publishing imprints, just so you know, not counting the books that we publish in the bookshop. So it's kind of 5 publishing imprints. And the publisher of all of those is Charles Perry, who is sitting here, who you may not know because he works downstairs as I do. You know, everybody sees this store, it's really lovely with all the books floor to ceiling, but we work in the basement. Our offices are in the basement, and that's like, so a lot of you don't see me, even if you're in the store, unless I happen to be passing by or something, and you seldom see Charles for the same reason, because he works downstairs. Anyway, enough of the preamble. I want to talk a little bit about mystery fiction in general, which I think since you're here, since you're customers of the bookshop, you took the trouble to come here, you know a lot about mysteries already. But I just want to talk specifically a little bit about the golden age. The golden age of mystery fiction is generally very glibly described as that era between the wars. And the book that is usually described as the cornerstone, the first book that really defines the beginning of the golden age, is Agatha Christie's The Mysterious Affair at Styles. The only thing wrong with that is it was published in 1920, and World War I by that time had ended 2 years before. And it also ignores one of the great under-remembered books that was published in 1913, Trent's Last Case by E.C. Bentley, which is really a classic detective story in every way. I was just going to give you too much of the ending. I won't do that. But if you ever want to read a Golden Age mystery story before the Golden Age, read Trent's Last Case. So we started a publishing company called American Mystery Classics. There was a British series sponsored by the British Museum about Golden Age British classic books. And we thought there were too many reissues and publications of great Golden Age, great classics of mystery fiction from Britain. And so we decided to start a company devoted to American mystery classics. And they look like this. There's a cover design that we created now almost 3 years ago, 2018. Right? 2018. Yeah. And they don't have the same cover, they don't have the same colors, but there's a design to it, a taste, a sense of these books that you'll see. There are a bunch of them arranged over there. And you can see that it's a series. And so we were doing reissues of the greatest writers in this series, starting with Ellery Queen. I think that was the first book that we picked on, that we picked for the list, the Chinese Orange Mystery. And we published 6 books all at once so that we would make kind of a splash in the publishing world and bookselling world So we had 6 books all at once in March of 2019.
No,
No,
fall of 2018.
fall of 2018. Thank you. And then we did 6 more in March of 2019. And then we've been doing 1 a month ever since then. I should just take a little side trip for just 1 second. We've published now 4 books by Ellery Queen in the series. I should introduce briefly Richard Danae, who is Frederick Danae's son. And if you know mystery fiction at all, you know that Ellery Queen was a pseudonym, a byline, by 2 cousins who lived in Brooklyn, Manfred B. Lee and Frederick Danae. And Richard is here tonight, and thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
When we do a book club, Charles hosts a book club. And when one of the books featured was an Ellery Queen book, Richard came to that, right? And you were one of the people who was
Quite a
around the
thrill.
table. Yeah, that was pretty exciting. Yeah, it really was. So, these are the classic British American mysteries from that golden age. Now, a lot of writers who started in the 1920s and 1930s kept writing, so into the 50s and 60s. But we're not publishing books that were published after 1949. So this series will only be books published in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. This series, we've done about 36 books now, 38,
Yeah.
40, yeah, that range, 1 a month. And very proud of this series. They're such great books. I really love these books. And we've been fortunate to be able to publish the best writers. We've been able to get the rights to the novels by the absolute best writers of that era. Ellery Queen, John Dixon Carr, Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Mary Roberts Reinhardt, by the way, for more than 15 years was the #2 best-selling writer in America. Her sales were exceeded only by Sinclair Lewis for about a 15-year period. We also did John P. Marquand, a Mr. Moto book. We've done Dorothy B. Hughes, who was the first, or among the very first, it's an argument about, but generally credited to be as the first woman to write tough books, hard-boiled books. They're not as hard-boiled as some books, but for the era, which was the 1940s, she was pretty much in advance of other writers of that time. And so we've done Charlotte Armstrong, and we've done at Cornell Woolrich, a great suspense writer. So this book, this collection of Golden Age detective stories, has my plan was, and I'd like to think that it's correct, was that it would use a story by most of the major writers who are in our series, so that if you didn't know who Charlotte Armstrong was, or you didn't know who Cornell Woolrich was, or some of these other writers, you could get a taste of their prose style by getting the anthology. I like to compare anthologies, and I've done about 70 anthologies now. It's like, what a misspent youth. Which I like to compare it to a box of Whitman chocolates, because you have a big sample and you really don't know what you're going to get in there. It's like a good party. You know, you're going to see some old friends, people that you know, and then you're going to meet some new people. And that's kind of the guiding force of the anthologies that I do, and certainly of this anthology. So if you haven't already read the book, I hope you will. And now Charles is going to ask me a question. Been waiting for his moment.
First, you have to introduce it.
Shut up, Otto. Could I just...
Well, you kind of touched on some of my first questions on that lengthy introduction, but I would say, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the specific stories and kind of stylistic. When we think about the Golden Age, there are certain stylistic traits that people would associate with those authors and novels. So I wonder how the stories in this volume kind of exemplify that Golden Age style.
Okay, that's a good question. I would say that it's fair to say that the golden age, both British and American, the major focus of mystery stories was the solving of a puzzle, of having a detective who comes onto the scene, whether he's a policeman, a private eye, or an amateur detective. There's a social fabric that has been ripped apart by somebody being murdered. And some detective comes in to hunt for clues, to find suspects, and make deductions, observations and deductions from the scene and around the scene. And the goal of that detective is to find all of those clues, eliminate all of the suspects except the guilty party, which happens generally at the end of the book. Sometimes everybody's gathered together, what Rex Stout used to do. No Rex Stout short stories, so there's no Nero Wolfe story in this book. He never wrote Nero Wolfe short stories, sadly. So their pure detective stories is like the center, the middle of the strike zone for Golden Age detective stories. Fair play, where the author would make a point of having all of the clues there. And if you're smart enough, you could figure it out. And Ellery Queen, I hate to keep going back, and I would do this even if you weren't here. Ellery Queen, in many of his early books, would stop the narrative and have a page in the book that basically said, to the reader, or dear reader, whatever it is, you now have all the information that you need to solve this crime. And if there's anything that can make you feel like an idiot, it's reading that page and saying, I do? Like, I have no clue. I have yet to actually deduce a real solution to any mysteries. I've guessed at some solutions and they've been right, but if you guess often enough, chances are you're going to be right sometimes. And that's all I can do. I am always fooled. The most likely suspect is always the person I'm absolutely convinced did it. And the least likely suspect, I said, no, it can't be her or him. So that is the major strike zone of this era and of the stories in this book. However, and oh, by the way, there is no John Dixon Carr story in the book. And it breaks my heart, but the agent is such a jerk that she would not, under any circumstances, let me publish a story without paying such an exorbitant fee that I would have had to take a second mortgage. So that's why there's no John Dixon Carr short story. But meanwhile, she is letting us publish the novels at very reasonable fees.
I should say that if she happens to be watching, we certainly appreciate it.
Just kidding, Georgia. Just kidding. Oh, that's right. We're not just in this room, are we?
No.
Can we edit these
Yes,
things?
you
or
can edit,
is it
you
too
can
late?
edit.
Anyway, so
from that sample you did.
Yeah.
so what we, in addition to those pure detective stories, we have some suspense stories. For example, Cornell Woolrich. It's actually a detective story, but he is the greatest suspense writer of the 20th century. He's the Poe of the 20th century. And we published 2 books by him, The Bride Wore Black and Waltz into Darkness, which are just masterpieces, but so many of his other books are too. Unfortunately, there are other publishers in America, and some of them are publishing some of Woolrich's books, and other books are being stories that we would like, books that we would like to publish. We can't because other publishers have them, but we get most of the good ones. So there are suspense stories. The Mary Roberts Reinhardt story is a suspense story. The Woolrich story is a suspense story and a detective story. There's a locked room mystery in there by Clayton Rawson, who was a friend of both Ellery Queen, Frederick Dane, and John Dixon Carr. They knew each other, they corresponded, and the central character of Clayton Rawson's books is a magician known as the Great Merlini, who, whenever the police in New York were stumped because the crime seemed totally impossible, they would go to the Great Merlini in his magic store where he sells magic things. In the sign, there's a sign in the window that says "Miracles for Sale," which is just so great. And then Merlini solves these totally impossible crimes. I love impossible crimes. What else is in there? The suspense story. Charlotte Armstrong was one of the great suspense writers. Dorothy B. Hughes is also a suspense writer as well as a detective story writer. What else is in this book? Who else is in
Baynard
it?
Kendrick story.
Baynard Kendrick. That's pure detective.
Yeah.
He's a blind detective who uses his other senses to help solve crimes because he can't see. So he finds other ways around that. Let me see who else is in here. Oh, of course, Earl Stanley Gardner. We've been publishing Earl Stanley Gardner in this series as well. And there were very few Perry Mason stories. I don't think there was ever an anthology, a collection of Perry Mason stories. There are a couple of books that have a Perry Mason story and then 3 other novels or novellas or short stories, but not featuring Perry Mason. So he's in here. One of my favorite stories is The Enchanted Garden by H.F. Hurd. He created a character called Mr. Mycroft, who kept bees on the Sussex Downs. Now, if you're a big Sherlock Holmes fan, you know that Sherlock Holmes retired to the Sussex Downs to keep bees. So this character is named Mr. Mycroft. Sherlock's brother was named Mycroft Holmes. So many people say that this character must be Sherlock Holmes. He is not really Sherlock Holmes, but he has many of the characteristics of Sherlock Holmes. So that's enough of the analysis of each story. What is next, Charles? What else do you want me to talk about next?
I wanted to move more generally into a question of if you think detective fiction, as opposed to other genres or styles, is particularly well suited to the short story, and if so, why?
Boy, these are good questions.
Thank you.
No wonder you get the big bucks. I will quote one of my favorite writers, John Dixon Carr, who said that I'm misquoting it here, so I'll paraphrase. The ideal form of the detective story is the short story. And his premise was that a detective story requires a detective to find clues, make deductions, and solve the crime in that way. That could be done in a short story. It's hard, it's really tricky, but it can be done. And his position was the rest is filler. You're developing the characters, which we like as novels and as entertainment, to give a fuller experience of reading and of literature. But for pure detection, everything else is added. I won't use the word padding because that's what it sounds like. But it's superfluous or not needed in order for a detective to find the clues and make the deductions. So having done 70 anthologies, I'm a huge short story fan. I know a lot of people don't like it. They don't feel that they're getting into it, that there's enough richness of characterization, of background, of sense of place, and all the things that make really serious literature. But I'm a great fan of the short form. I also I like novels too, especially like some long novels. I used to read a lot of Victorian fiction, including detective fiction, mystery fiction from that era. So, but I'm not picking one over the other. I'm just saying that anybody who says, well, I don't like short stories, they're really not giving the short story a fair chance because they're certainly worth reading.
Okay. Next question is, I'd like to hear your take on the art of the anthology. How did you go about selecting stories for this? And is your process for a more focused anthology such as this different from the big books and stuff like that?
Okay. This is a little, I can be a little less specific about this because I'm a little less sure. For those of you who don't know this, among the 70 or so anthologies, I kind of lost count, of the 70 or so anthologies that I've done, there are several kinds. One is the best mystery stories of the year. And that is, I have a reader. She's been working with me for 40 years. I could not do these books without her. She looks at between 3,000 and 4,000 stories a year. Every literary journal, every popular consumer magazine, online anthologies that are published that have short story collections by writers with short. She looks at between 3,000 and 4,000 a year, culls the list to 200 or 300, which I then read, and then from that pick the 50 best, which go to the guest editor, who picks the 20 that go into the book, and then some of the others are listed on a roll of other good stories for the year. So those stories are kind of self-selecting in the sense that if they're really well written, if they're fabulous, I don't care if they're detective stories, suspense stories, crime stories. I define the mystery as any story, any work of fiction in which a crime or the threat of a crime is central to the plot or the theme. Now, that's very wide definition. It doesn't include Westerns, which generally have crime. The marshal comes into town and sheriff and all of that, because it's its own genre. But that's how mysteries, the big book of Sherlock Holmes stories, the big book of real murders, REEL, stories that were then taken and made into screenplays. So those stories don't take any kind of creativity. I just have to find all of the stories in that subgenre that are really good. I usually read somewhere between 300 and 500 stories to pick the 50 or 60 stories. In one case, close to 80 stories, really fat book, that go into that very specific genre. Other thematic stories that I've done 7 sports stories, sports story anthologies. Murderer's Row, which was a baseball anthology, and several like that, several of that sort. So those are also self-defining. This book was kind of a very narrow range of stories for me to look at. I probably only read about 100 or 120 stories to find the best stories by each of the writers, but we had determined in advance that the writers who were going to be in this book are writers that are also in the series that we're doing as novels. So that limited the number of writers that I needed to look at to try to find my anthology. In an ideal anthology, I want a big range, like some tough stories, some cozy stories, suspense stories, detective stories, literary stories. I like a really big range so that everybody will find something that they'd like, and they may be surprised to find some things that they didn't think they would like and then do like, if I'm doing it right. And I am, because I'm really good at this. But another quick sideline, I'm the second best anthologist who ever lived, in all humility, because the greatest by far was Ellery Queen. And I would say I've written it and I've said it without you being in the room. I mean it. And I've stolen some of his ideas. He did a book called The Female of the Species, which were the great women detectives. Well, mine was different. It was women writers. But that book was women detectives and criminals. The greatest anthology ever produced, I thought, was 101 Years Entertainment. It's that fat that Ellery Queen did in 1941, I think. And it brought to a popular audience the great classics from the 19th century and the early 20th century into the middle of the 20th century. And the range of stories and the selection of stories has never been surpassed. So I just have to tip my hat to Ellery Queen, to Frederick Dannay. Although Manfred B. Lee and Frederick Dannay wrote the books together, it was Fred who started Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine. He was the collector of rare books in the mystery field. He was the editor of the anthologies, and he wrote reference books in this field. The detective short story was the first reference book that was a bibliography of the short story collections. So Queen's Quorum was a book that he wrote selecting the 106 greatest collections of mystery stories in the history of the genre. And then later he added another 19 stories to make it the 125 best. And a lot of people collect the Queen's Quorum. It was a very challenging collection to get in first edition. And early on, it's one of the first things that I try to collect because I love short stories and I love the great ones. And that was a great collection to do. And I got every story in that book, in that collection, which almost nobody can say.
What's next?
What's next? What's next, I think, is we should ask if anybody here has, what time is it? We decided we're going to do this for a half hour. That's a half hour. And so if there are any questions, I'd be happy to ask them. Did you just raise your hand?
What do you mean when you say a suspense story?
When I say a what?
A suspense story versus
A suspense story. A suspense story is well, it's filled with suspense. It's a story that puts
like
some.
the crime is not over, there's still danger.
The suspense is not knowing what's going to happen next. In a detective story, you know what's going to happen next. What happens next is the detective is looking for the clue. In a classic detective story, detective's looking clues, and you know he's going to find them, find the killer, and that's the denouement. In a suspense story, if it's a really great suspense writer, there's a character that you identify with, that you are aware of, and you feel that you are in the shoes of that character. Doesn't matter if it's male or female, young or old. It's about you have now become that person, and that person is scared to death because he or she knows that she's about to be killed. And because Cornell Woolrich is the greatest suspense writer who ever lived, you never know what the denouement is. And there are books and stories in which this person with whom you've identified the whole time, and you are waiting for that guy, that woman to no, it's killed. Or I'll tell you a quick Cornell Woolrich story. A woman is married to a very, very abusive husband. And she has a boyfriend, finds somebody who really cares about her. She falls in love, he falls in love, and she decides that that she's going to escape, and he's going to wait for her. And she's going to come out the window of this room where he's essentially keeping her as a prisoner. And he sets up a ladder for her, and she starts to come down the ladder and falls and is paralyzed. And her husband said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of her." And the title of the story is for the rest of her life.
Oh,
Okay.
Mm.
Now do you get the idea of what a suspense story is? Anybody else?
Yes, I was just,
You next.
my experience is probably 95% post Golden Age.
Okay.
And so I'm very excited to hear about all the great fun I'm going to have in reading this. But what changed? What changed between the wars moving into post Second War?
Great. It's a really great question. If you didn't hear it, because you have a soft voice and you were facing this way,
Yeah.
so you might not have heard. If I could just shorten and paraphrase, what is the difference between Golden Age stories and stories today? And the major difference is everything was about the puzzle. A lot of the classic writers of that era were not particularly good writers, but they were brilliant plotters, brilliant puzzle creators, and the reader wanted to do a crossword puzzle or a jigsaw puzzle, or read a detective story and figure out what was happening. That was the major goal. The better ones, of course, also created really good characters and had a great sense of place and so on. But a lot of the Golden Age writers, if you tried to read them today, they may have made really good plots, but they're almost unreadable because their prose was so awful and so on. So that was the generally accepted. When people talk about mysteries, they frequently just think it's detective stories. They're not talking about crime stories or suspense stories or espionage stories, which are mysteries too. So when people talk about mysteries, they frequently are thinking of detective stories and finding the clues and finding the killer and so on. As time went by, and as we went into, I'm going to say probably the 70s, 80s, the focus began. I'm not exactly sure what did it or why it happened. Partly, I think, because Agatha Christie, Ellery Queen, John Dixon Carr, and maybe 4 or 5 other writers used up every good plot. There were no more plots. So the focus became not so much on who done it, but on why done it. Psychology became a more accepted, quote, science. I was a psych major in my early years, and psychology is not a science. So if you're going to a psychologist, quit, because you're wasting your money. They can't help you. Talk to your bartender or your hairdresser instead, because they're just as helpful. And if you're a psychologist watching, I'm really sorry. I'm joking. So as psychology became a more accepted science, for want of a better word, that crept into mystery stories. And so the focus became why done it. And that really is still a very common trope of crime fiction these days, of the motivation. What set this person off? Why is this person so hard? Why is Dr. Lecter killing all these people? It's a psychological element.
I just wanted to, sorry to interrupt before, but that story you told about the woman and the abusive husband, and she gets paralyzed.
No, she doesn't beat her husband. He beats her.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He beats her.
There's a little difference.
So, right, and it says that he's going to take care of her for the rest of her life. So, is there any indication in this story about, did her life last much longer?
No, the story ends when he says, "Don't worry, I'll take care of you for the rest of your life." Yes, sir.
I wanted to. It's kind of similar to the gentleman in the front row's question, which was inside the golden age. Did you notice maybe micro trends in that, of where it's like you're noticing as the years go by, there's changes in if it's the larger theme of puzzles or other themes, as maybe similar to maybe because of the wars, maybe changes in economics or whatever. Did you witness any of that?
Yeah, sure. When I'm talking about a lot of the things that I've been talking about, I'm generalizing in a sense. There were golden age mystery stories that had nothing to do with finding the clue. There were suspense stories written in. The psychological suspense were not unknown at all in that era, and there are still fair play detective stories being written today. I think there are more serial killer books written today than there were in the 20s and 30s. Are there more police procedurals now? No, I guess not. I guess there were just as many police procedurals then. But there were many writers like Mignon Eberhardt or Charlotte Armstrong, Mary Roberts Reinhardt, Dorothy B. Hughes, who had very heavy elements of psychology, psychological motivations for their stories. And even the pure detective story, inevitably there would be some elements of psychology involved, because in order to find the murderer, you had to find a motive. Almost always had to find a motive, and the motive would have a psychological element to it. Now, of course, during the war, after the war, a lot of people became much more accustomed to violence, the concept of violence, because they were getting the war news on a regular basis, large numbers of deaths. And so, the vicar murdering somebody in his garden maybe wasn't satisfactory enough for a lot of the people who came through the war, who had family, were in the war, killed or maimed or barely getting out, coming back with psychological trauma of all kinds. So there's no sharp delineation of when things changed, but they evolved into where we are today. And really, in recent years, it is not uncommon for mystery fiction to have criminals get away with it, and criminals frequently are the central protagonists of books. And once you have a central protagonist, that's the person that the reader generally identifies with. You can see this in things like the caper novels of Donald Westlake. So the Dortmunder character, they're hilarious books. They're wonderful books. If you don't know them, read Donald Westlake. You will thank me. So Dortmunder plans this wonderful big crime, a burglary, a con game, whatever it is. He has the most meticulously crafted plan to make a whole lot of money, and then things go wrong. Not his fault. It's never his fault. The plan is perfect, but something always goes wrong, and as a result, you are identifying with Dortmunder, and you're rooting for him to succeed in stealing the hot rock, for example, which was the movie based on his first novel. And if you've ever seen the movie with Robert Redford, it's hilarious, and the book is even better. So yeah, there's a mixture in all those things, and there's a mixture now. There are detective stories, suspense stories, crime stories, police procedure. There's all of it it's all out there.
Just to piggyback on that answer, I'll say that this book actually highlights kind of the diversity that you would see in styles from that period. Even though they all fall into the golden age, I mean, each one of these stories is totally different. And you can identify, different forms of suspense or different forms of detection. But, to call them like micro trends, I don't know how much cohesiveness there was between different authors trying different styles, but it certainly is a varied period, I think.
Okay, I think that's going to wind it up. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you. If anybody wants to get a book signed, I'm delighted to do it. I could do it anytime because I actually work here, so. But now's the time to do that.